1941. The swastika flag flies from the Atlantic coast to the outskirts of Moscow. The world watches in horror at the invincible machine of the Wehrmacht. It seems the fate of the planet is sealed. But what if I told you, Germany was already doomed at this moment? Most amateur historians look for Hitler's defeat in the snows of Moscow, or in the sands of Stalingrad. But the truth is far harsher. The verdict on the Third Reich was signed, not by generals on the battlefield, but by economists and logisticians in the 1930s. Today we will explore why the German blitzkrieg was just a flashy facade of a rotten house. Why Hitler lost the war of resources before the first tank crossed the Polish border. And how one dictator's overconfidence turned the best army in the world into a system that had no chance against mathematics. Let's start with a simple rule of history that is often forgotten amid the noise of battle. War is primarily about mathematics and logistics. In 1939, the German economy resembled the muscle of an athlete on steroids. Powerful on the outside, but completely hollow on the inside. When Hitler came to power, he promised an economic miracle. And it happened, but there was one problem: it wasn't real. The Reich built a system of MIFO bills. This was a grand financial manipulation by Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's chief banker. The state paid military factories with paper that wasn't backed by real money. It was, effectively, a giant government pyramid scheme. By 1939, the repayment deadline for these papers was approaching. Germany faced an abyss: either total economic collapse and hyperinflation, or looting its neighbors. An interesting fact about gold. Did you know that before the invasion of Poland, the Reich's foreign reserves were virtually zero? They had no foreign currency to buy even basic raw materials, oil, rubber, or copper, on the world market. The only way to survive was the physical seizure of other countries' gold reserves. Austrian gold, Czechoslovakian gold. These resources literally fed the German war machine, allowing it to last a few more months. Germany wasn't just willing to fight, it was forced to loot just so its economy wouldn't collapse overnight. Now, let's look at the other side of the Atlantic. While Germany was trying to survive through plunder, the United States was launching what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. And here we come to the critical mistake of the Reich, a misunderstanding of modern industry. Germany was proud of its craftsmen. Every German tank was assembled like an expensive watch, by hand, with meticulous fitting of parts. It looked cool, but it was disastrously slow. America, on the other hand, bet on total standardization. What does that mean in practice? Imagine. At Henry Ford's factories, parts for aircraft or trucks were made with such precision that a part from a plane produced in Detroit fit perfectly into a plane assembled in California. This allowed for repairing equipment right on the battlefield, assembling one whole machine from 3 damaged ones. In contrast, even tanks of the same German model, but from different series, could have unique parts that weren't interchangeable. An impressive example: the Liberty class ships. These were huge transport vessels that carried cargo to Europe. At the start of the war, they were built in 200 days. But thanks to standardization in the assembly line, the US reduced this time to 4 days and 15 hours. German submarines physically couldn't sink ships as fast as American factories were producing them. And this brings us to Lend-Lease. Many people think it was just aid. In reality, it was an industrial tsunami. The US sent the Allies over 400,000 Studebaker trucks. Imagine. While a German soldier was pulling a cannon with horses through the mud, a Soviet or British soldier was driving a reliable American truck. The US didn't just give the Allies weapons. They gave them the blood of war, high-octane aviation fuel, which the Reich couldn't produce in sufficient quantities, and millions of tons of food. The Soviet army literally survived on American spam. By 1941, when Hitler declared war on the US, he effectively declared war on the largest factory in human history. The combined GDP of the Allied powers surpassed the Axis powers by 5 times. You can win a battle, you can capture a city, but you cannot win a war against an assembly line that works 24/7 and doesn't know resource shortages. Germany was a bankrupt trying to win in a casino against a billionaire. And that loss was decided the moment the first American factory switched to wartime production. But economic figures on paper are just cold theory. The real Bloody horror began when that theory collided with the reality of the Eastern Front. There is a persistent myth, created by Goebbels' propaganda. Endless columns of tanks and trucks moving east, an invincible Wehrmacht. In reality, the German army was an archaic structure. About 80% of all German divisions relied not on the internal combustion engine, but on horsepower. Literally, over 600,000 horses were used for the invasion of the USSR. This was a 19th-century army trying to fight a 20th-century war. Let's look at the micro-history of the 4th Panzer Division. This was the elite, the iron fist, of General Heinz Guderian. In June, 41, they seemed invincible. But by October, they faced something no general staff had accounted for, a logistical collapse. First came the Rasputitsa, the impassable mud. German tanks had narrow tracks that instantly bogged down in the Russian black soil during the autumn rains. Trucks got stuck, and that's when the exhausted, starving horses came to the rescue. But the real hell began in November, when the temperature sharply dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. From the diary of a non-commissioned officer of the 4th Division. We are trying to light fires under the tank engines to melt the oil. It has turned to stone. The steel becomes so brittle that it shatters on impact. Our machine guns jam because the lubricant inside has frozen. We are not fighting. We are trying to just not turn into ice in these metal boxes. German logistics were planned for 6 weeks. Hitler was confident the USSR would collapse faster than supplies ran out. But the war continued. When trains with warm clothing and special winter lubricants should have been arriving at the front, the railways were jammed with, what do you think? Ammunition and food, because the army was too large for such a weak transport network. Priorities were broken. Another soldier wrote home. They brought us reinforcements, summer uniforms and Christmas presents. We have 4th-degree frostbite. We are eating horse meat from horses that died of hunger a week ago, and Berlin is sending us chocolate and postcards. They don't even understand in their offices that we are already dead, just still walking. The main, fatal problem was oil. Germany didn't have it. They couldn't produce enough synthetic fuel. Every kilometer a tank advanced eastward made it weaker, as the supply lines stretched further. Blitzkrieg is a poor man's strategy. You must win instantly, because you don't have the resources for a prolonged game. When the Germans failed to deliver the final blow near Moscow, they lost the war mathematically. Because next began a game where the winner is the one with more oil, steel, and people. And in that game, the Reich had no chance. They turned their elite tanks into immobile metal coffins. By the scorching summer of 1940, the world watched in stunned silence as the Nazi war machine reached the edge of the Atlantic. Poland had fallen in weeks, Norway had been outmaneuvered, and France, the strongest land power in Europe, had collapsed in a mere 40 days. Only one obstacle remained between Adolf Hitler and total hegemony over Europe, the 21 miles of the English Channel. To launch Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious invasion of Great Britain, the German Wehrmacht required one absolute condition: total air superiority. They needed to sweep the Royal Air Force from the sky. This led to the Battle of Britain, the first major strategic campaign in history fought entirely in the air, and the first place where the Reich's invincibility met a wall of cold, scientific resistance. Initially, the Luftwaffe, under the command of the flamboyant and arrogant Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, followed a brutal but effective military logic. They targeted the eyes and ears of the British defense, the Dowding system. This was the world's first integrated air defense network, utilizing a chain of coastal radar stations known as Chain Home. German bombers hammered these towers and, more critically, the sector airfields of the RAF's Fighter Command in southeast England. By late August and early September 1940, the situation for Britain was nothing short of catastrophic. The RAF was losing experienced pilots and modern Spitfires faster than the factories could build them or the schools could train them. Ground crews were working 20-hour shifts under constant bombardment, filling craters in runways while the next wave of Messerschmitts was already on the horizon. High-ranking British officers later admitted that the RAF was only days away from a total collapse of its organizational structure. Then, a single accident changed the course of world history. On the night of August 24, 1940, a small group of German bombers, lost in the darkness and under heavy anti-aircraft fire, accidentally dropped their payloads over the center of London, hitting civilian neighborhoods. In retaliation, Winston Churchill, knowing he needed to provoke Hitler, ordered a symbolic raid on Berlin. On the night of August 25, British bombers reached the Nazi capital. The physical damage to Berlin was negligible, but the psychological blow to the Nazi leadership was tectonic. Göring had famously promised the German people, "If an enemy bomb ever falls on Berlin, you can call me Meyer." Hitler, consumed by a need for prestige and political revenge, fell right into Churchill's trap. He ordered a complete shift in strategy. He commanded the Luftwaffe to stop attacking the vital RAF airfields and instead launch a massive, sustained terror campaign against London and other industrial cities. This was the beginning of the Blitz. This was the Reich's fatal strategic suicide. While the world watched London burn in the night sky, the RAF was given a miraculous, life-saving, breathing space. With the relentless pressure off their airfields, the British repaired their runways, replaced their damaged radar masts, and allowed their exhausted pilots to finally get a few hours of sleep. The Germans had stopped attacking the very heart of the British defense system at the exact moment it was about to break. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe faced a crippling technical limitation that Göring had ignored. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's primary fighter, was operating at the extreme limit of its range. When flying over London, German pilots had only 10 to 20 minutes of fuel for actual combat before they were forced to turn back across the Channel. Every minute spent chasing a Spitfire over the Thames was a minute that risked a fuel-starved crash into the sea. Consider the micro-history of a Luftwaffe pilot during this period. Archives contain accounts from pilots who felt the shifting tide. One veteran wrote, "We flew over the great city and saw the fires reflecting on our wings. We felt like gods, masters of the sky. But then, from the clouds we thought were clear, the Spitfires appeared again. And then the hurricanes. Our commanders told us the RAF had been annihilated weeks ago. Yet here they were, more aggressive, better coordinated, and seemingly endless." Every evening, the mess hall felt emptier. We were winning the battles, but we were losing the war. By prioritizing civilian terror over military targets, Germany traded a decisive strategic victory for a failed attempt to break British morale. The British people did not break, they hardened. On September 15, 1940, now known as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched its largest assault on London, only to be met by a fully recovered and reorganized RAF. The German losses were so heavy that Hitler was forced to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. In this struggle, Germany lost over 1,800 aircraft and thousands of their most elite, combat-experienced aircrews, veterans of Spain, Poland, and France. These were men and machines the Reich would desperately need just 1 year later during the invasion of the Soviet Union. By failing to finish the RAF in 1940, Hitler ensured that Britain would remain a stationary aircraft carrier for the United States to later use as a springboard for the liberation of Europe. The Battle of Britain proved that the Nazi leadership valued prestige and vengeance more than cold strategic reality. It was a failure of intelligence, a failure of logistics, and a failure of command. In the skies over England, the Reich did not just lose a battle, they lost the chance to end the war on their own terms. The 1,000-year Reich had reached its high watermark, and from here, the only way was down. When we study the history of the Second World War, we often look at the Axis powers as a monolithic block, a unified machine of conquest. But if you look closer at the archives and the diplomatic cables of the time, a different picture emerges. The better question isn't, who were Germany's allies? But rather, who did Germany have to fight for instead of with? The tragic reality for the German high command was that their allies did not multiply the Reich's power, they drained it like a parasite. While the Allied powers, the US, UK, and USSR, eventually learned to coordinate their grand strategy, the Axis was a coalition of egos, secrets, and catastrophic incompetence. Let's start with Italy. Benito Mussolini, the Duce, wanted to build a new Roman Empire. His parades in Rome were magnificent, his speeches were fiery, and his troops looked imposing on film. But the Italian military was hollow. It was plagued by corruption, obsolete equipment, and a complete lack of modern industrial backing. In October 1940, seeking a prestige victory to match Hitler's conquest of France, Mussolini invaded Greece. He expected a walkover. Instead, he walked into a slaughter. The Greek army, though smaller and less equipped, fought with a ferocity that stunned the world. They didn't just stop the Italians, they counter-attacked, pushing Mussolini's legions back into the mountains of Albania. At this precise moment, Hitler faced a strategic nightmare. He was already planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He needed every tank, every plane, and every soldier concentrated on the eastern border. But he couldn't allow his primary European ally to collapse and leave the Balkans open to British intervention. The cost of this rescue was the turning point of the war. The Wehrmacht was forced to postpone the invasion of the USSR to clear up Mussolini's mess in Greece and Yugoslavia. The campaign was a lightning success, but it cost Germany 6 critical weeks. 6 weeks of perfect summer weather. History would later show that these were exactly the 6 weeks that separated German tanks from the spires of the Kremlin before the Russian winter turned the ground into an icy grave. By saving his ally, Hitler doomed his own campaign against Stalin. Now, look at North Africa. The situation was a mirror image of the Balkans. Italian forces in Libya were being decimated by a much smaller British force. Again, Hitler had to intervene. He sent Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to prevent a total Italian collapse. Rommel became a legend, the Desert Fox, but his presence in Africa was a strategic distraction. Germany was pouring elite troops and precious fuel into a theater that had no direct path to winning the war, simply to patch a front that their ally couldn't hold. The Reich was spreading its forces thin across 3 continents, while its enemies were concentrating theirs. Then, there was the silent ally, Japan. This was perhaps the greatest diplomatic failure of the war. Hitler desperately needed Japan to strike the Soviet Union from the east. He imagined a pincer move that would force Stalin to fight a 2-front war, split his resources, and collapse the Red Army. But Japan had its own agenda. After a humiliating defeat by the Soviets at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, the Japanese military leadership had no desire to fight the Russians again. Instead of looking north to the Siberian wastes, Japan looked south, to the oil of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber of Malaya. On April 13, 1941, Japan signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. For Germany, this was a disaster. It allowed Stalin to receive intelligence from his master spy, Richard Sorge, confirming that Japan would not attack from the east. With this guarantee, Stalin took a massive gamble. He moved 20 elite, winter-hardened Siberian divisions from the Pacific coast to the gates of Moscow. These fresh, well-equipped troops arrived exactly when the German offensive was at its breaking point. While Germany was busy fighting for its allies in the mountains of Greece and the sands of Libya, its greatest enemy was receiving reinforcements that would change the course of history. The lesson is clear. Germany built a coalition of burdens, not partners. They failed to coordinate, they failed to share technology, and they failed to align their goals. In the end, the Reich didn't have a grand alliance. It had a series of liabilities that forced it to waste its strength on sideshows while the main event, the battle for the heart of Eurasia, slipped through its fingers. The war was lost not just because of the strength of the Allies, but because of the fatal weakness of the Axis. In the popular imagination, German engineering is synonymous with precision and genius. And during the Second World War, this was largely true. The Panther, the Tiger, the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. These were technical masterpieces, often superior to Allied designs on a purely technical level. And that, tragically for the Reich, was their greatest downfall. The fundamental flaw in German industrial strategy was a pursuit of perfection over practicality, quality over quantity. The Allied nations realized that war in the 20th century was a brutal exercise in mass production and logistics. Germany, however, fought a war based on outdated artisanal principles. Let's look at the staggering scale difference. The United States produced over 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks during the war. The Soviet Union churned out more than 80,000 T-34s. In contrast, Germany produced fewer than 1,400 Tiger I and II tanks combined. The Tiger was an apex predator on the battlefield. Its 88mm cannon could knock out any Allied tank from a distance of 2 kilometers. But it was also a logistical nightmare. It was over-engineered, heavy, complex, and suffered from constant mechanical breakdowns. It was almost impossible to repair in the field. When a Tiger broke down in the mud of the Eastern Front, it wasn't repaired. It was often abandoned or destroyed by its own crew. It was a masterpiece of engineering that failed the primary test of warfare: reliability and mass production. This obsession with complex, specialized designs led to the infamous German tank zoo. They had dozens of variations of tanks and armored vehicles, each requiring unique parts, training, and maintenance manuals. This chaos crippled their supply lines. When a part broke on a French-designed German tank in Russia, that part was likely in a warehouse back in Paris. But the technological folly didn't stop at tanks. Hitler became obsessed with Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. Millions of Reichsmarks and immense industrial effort were poured into desperate, last-minute projects designed to turn the tide. The V-2 rocket was perhaps the most famous example. It was the precursor to modern ballistic missiles. It was technologically brilliant, yet, as a weapon of war, it was a colossal failure. The V-2 killed more people during its manufacture, slave labor in underground factories, than it did in its attacks on London and Antwerp. It was a terror weapon, yes, but it could not destroy factories, it could not stop armies, and it consumed a vast amount of resources, high-grade steel and fuel, that could have built hundreds of fighter planes to defend German cities from Allied bombers. The Reich was playing a technological theater, prioritizing grandiose projects over the mundane reality of war logistics. While Germany was chasing rockets that changed nothing, the Allies were investing in technologies that won the war: radar and sonar. The British perfected radar, the technology that won the Battle of Britain and defeated the U-boats in the Atlantic. Medicine. The mass production of penicillin saved hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers' lives, ensuring their rapid return to the front. The atomic project. The Manhattan Project, driven largely by the brilliant minds that Hitler had exiled from Germany due to racist ideology, was a massive industrial and scientific undertaking that fundamentally ended the war. The Germans, through their ideological blindness and tactical misjudgments, lost the Battle of the Laboratories long before the war ended. They focused on building an elegant sword when their enemies were building an industrial sledgehammer. In the end, the sheer weight of mass production and practical, standardized engineering crushed German ingenuity. So, we return to our central question: could Germany have truly won World War II? Looking at the raw data, the resources, the logistics, the global geopolitics, the answer is a resounding no. They had no chance. The swift, spectacular victories of 1939 and 1940 were not proof of the Reich's inherent strength, but rather a result of their opponents' complete lack of readiness, their outdated doctrines, and their shattered morale from the First World War. The Third Reich built a facade of invincibility, but the reality was that modern wars of attrition are not won by dramatic parades in Nuremberg or by the sheer willpower of a dictator. They are won by factories, by supply chains, and by cold, calculated mathematics. Germany did not lose because its soldiers were weak or its engineers were untalented. They lost because their entire system was built on a series of fatal illusions. The illusion that an economy could run forever on debt and stolen gold. The illusion that a modern army could run on horsepower. And the illusion that one man's ego could dictate strategic reality. The Allies figured out how to make war a simple, repeatable industrial process. Germany tried to make it an art form. The industrial hammer always beats the delicate sculpture. The Second World War was a brutal lesson in the limits of ideology against the cold hard facts of logistics. The system of the Third Reich was flawed from day one, doomed to collapse when the quick victory they so desperately needed never materialized. What do you think? Would history have been fundamentally different if Hitler had maintained the pressure and destroyed the RAF airfields in Britain? Or if Japan had actually opened a second front against the USSR? Write your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We read every one. If you want history discussed without the myths and the propaganda, subscribe to the channel and join our community. Thanks for watching.